The creak of old wooden stairs echoed through the quiet house as 10-year-old Emma climbed to the attic, her flashlight illuminating dusty cobwebs and forgotten relics. The air was musty, tinged with the scent of mothballs and time-worn wood, and Emma felt a tingle of both excitement and unease. Exploring her grandmother's house always felt like stepping into another world, and the attic, off-limits until today, was the most mysterious part of all. "Emma, don't take too long up there," her mother called from downstairs. "I won't," Emma shouted back, her voice wavering slightly as she pushed open the attic door. The attic was like a treasure trove of forgotten memories. Cardboard boxes were stacked precariously, and mismatched furniture was shoved into the corners. An old rocking horse stood silently by the window, its paint faded and peeling. Emma's light danced over a tarnished mirror, piles of faded books, and a sewing mannequin draped with a moth-eaten dress. Then she saw it. Half hidden beneath an old quilt, something small and round peeked out. A porcelain face, with eyes that seemed to glint in the faint light. Emma pulled the quilt aside, revealing a doll. It was unlike any doll Emma had ever seen. The porcelain face was intricately painted, with rosy cheeks and lips curved in a faint smile. Her eyes, unervingly lifelike, were a pale blue that almost seemed to glow. Her curly, auburn hair was tied back with a faded ribbon, and she wore a lace-trimmed dress, yellowed with age. "Wow," Emma whispered, her fingers brushing against the doll's icy surface. She cradled the doll in her arms and carried it downstairs. Emma's grandmother, Margaret, was sitting in her favorite armchair, knitting. Her eyes flicked up when Emma entered the room, the doll clasped tightly to her chest. "Where did you find that?" Margaret's voice was sharp, almost alarmed. "In the attic," Emma replied. "She's beautiful." "What's her name?" Margaret's expression darkened. For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers gripping the knitting needles tightly. "That's not a toy, Emma," she said finally. "Put it back where you found it." "But why?" "Just do as I say," Margaret snapped, her tone brooking no argument. Emma's mother intervened, sensing the tension. "It's just an old doll, Mom. Let her keep it if she likes." Margaret opened her mouth to argue but then closed it again. She shook her head, muttering something under her breath. Emma felt a pang of guilt but couldn't bring herself to part with the doll. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she set the doll on her nightstand, its glassy eyes staring out into the dark. The first strange occurrence happened at midnight. Emma woke to the faint sound of music. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, and seemed to be coming from her nightstand. Groggy and confused, Emma reached for the doll, but it was cold to the touch. The music stopped. "Hello," Emma whispered into the darkness, but the only response was the creak of the floorboards settling. She told herself it was her imagination and pulled the covers tightly around her. Still, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Emma's mother found her staring at the doll, her breakfast untouched. "Did you sleep well, honey?" she asked, ruffling Emma's hair. "Not really," Emma admitted. "I think the doll was playing music." Her mother laughed. "It's probably one of those old dolls with a music box inside. Maybe it's broken." Emma wanted to believe her, but something about the doll felt wrong. That afternoon, Margaret sat Emma down. "I told you to put that doll back," she said, her voice low. "Why? What's so bad about her?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting to the doll on the kitchen table. "Her name is Clara. She belonged to my sister, Abigail." "You never told me you had a sister." "Because I don't like talking about her," Margaret snapped. Emma leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What happened to her?" Margaret's face went pale. "It doesn't matter. Just put the doll back, Emma. It's better for everyone." That night, the music returned, louder and more haunting than before. This time, Emma didn't wake alone. Her mother came rushing into the room, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Emma nodded. The doll sat on the nightstand, its eyes glittering in the moonlight. Emma's mother reached for it, but the moment her fingers touched the porcelain, the music stopped. A single word, faint but chilling, seemed to echo in the room. "Stay." Emma and her mother stared at each other, both too terrified to speak. The next morning, Margaret found them in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. She looked at the doll in Emma's hands and sighed. "It's time you knew the truth," she said, her voice heavy with dread. But before she could continue, the kitchen door slammed shut on its own. The kitchen door rattled on its hinges, slamming repeatedly as if an unseen wind was forcing it shut. Emma, clutching the doll tightly, felt her grandmother's hand grip her shoulder with surprising strength. Margaret's face was ashen, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," Margaret ordered, her voice trembling but firm. She moved toward the door, her frail frame seemingly emboldened by a determination to face whatever was happening. Emma's mother, Claire, tried to intervene. "Mom, you're not going in there alone." Margaret raised a hand, silencing her. "I've dealt with Clara before. She won't hurt me, I think." As Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, the sound of slamming stopped abruptly. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards. Emma's mother grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. "We're leaving," she whispered. "No!" Emma cried, clutching the doll tighter. Despite the fear swirling in her, she felt a strange connection to Clara, a pull she couldn't explain. Margaret returned moments later, her face pale but composed. "The doll stays," she announced firmly. "And so do you, at least until you understand what we're dealing with." Claire exploded. "Mom, what is going on? This isn't just some old family heirloom, is it?" Margaret sat heavily in her chair. For a long moment, she stared at the doll in Emma's lap, her expression a mixture of sorrow and dread. "Clara belonged to Abigail, my younger sister," Margaret began, her voice low and halting. "Abby loved that doll more than anything. But Clara, she wasn't just a doll." Emma leaned forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "What do you mean?" Margaret's hands trembled as she continued. "Abigail found Clara in the woods near our house when we were children. She said she heard crying, like a lost child, and followed the sound until she found the doll lying in a hollow tree. At first, Clara seemed ordinary, but strange things started happening after Abby brought her home. Things moved on their own. We'd hear whispers at night." Claire crossed her arms. "You're saying this doll is haunted?" Margaret shook her head. "Haunted would be easier to understand. Clara is alive in her own way. She feeds on attention, on emotions. Abby became obsessed with her. She stopped playing with other children, stopped talking to us, and spent all her time with Clara." Emma's grip on the doll loosened slightly, a shiver running down her spine. "One night," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Abby disappeared. We found her the next morning, curled up in the attic, clutching Clara. She was different. Her eyes were empty, her voice monotone. She said Clara had told her things. Terrible, impossible things. My parents tried to get rid of the doll, but every time they did, it came back." As Margaret spoke, the doll seemed to radiate a coldness that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Emma could swear its glassy eyes flickered toward her, just for a moment. Eventually, "Abby." "She vanished," Margaret said, tears brimming in her eyes. "One morning, she was just gone. Clara was left behind, sitting on her bed like nothing had happened." Emma's mother shook her head. "And you kept it? Why didn't you destroy it?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "You think I didn't try? Fire, water, hammers, nothing worked. Clara always came back, as if she was part of this house. So I locked her in the attic and hoped she'd stay forgotten." Emma's voice was barely audible. "But she didn't." "No," Margaret said. "She didn't." That night, sleep was elusive. Margaret insisted the doll stay in the living room. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's presence lingered everywhere. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her room, and the faint strains of that haunting lullaby drifted through the house, though no one could pinpoint its source. Emma's dreams were no escape. She saw a little girl, pale with hollow eyes, holding Clara in her arms. The girl stood in a dark forest, surrounded by faintly glowing figures. "Help us," the girl whispered, her voice like dry leaves. Emma woke with a start, her heart pounding. She turned to the nightstand out of habit, forgetting for a moment that Clara was no longer there. But Clara was. The doll sat upright, its blue eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Screaming, Emma leapt out of bed, waking the entire household. Margaret was the first to arrive, her face a mask of terror as she saw Clara perched on the bed. "I told you," Margaret cried, snatching the doll and carrying it out of the room. Claire, her patience fraying, pulled Margaret aside. "We can't live like this. There has to be a way to end this nightmare." Margaret hesitated. "There is one way, but it's dangerous." "Anything is better than this," Claire insisted. Margaret sighed heavily. "The forest where Abigail found Clara, I think that's where she came from. If we take her back, maybe we can end this." Emma, still trembling, stepped forward. "I'll come with you." "No," Margaret and Claire said in unison. But Emma stood her ground. "I'm the one Clara's been following. I have to be there." The following evening, under the cover of dusk, they set out for the forest. Margaret carried Clara in a box, its lid tied shut with rope. The journey was silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and a dense fog began to rise, wrapping around them like a shroud. "This is the place," Margaret said, stopping abruptly at the base of a twisted tree. Its gnarled branches reached skyward like skeletal fingers, and the hollow at its base yawned like an open mouth. Emma felt a wave of nausea. The tree felt alive, its presence oppressive and malevolent. Margaret knelt and placed the box before the hollow. "Clara," she said softly, her voice trembling, "we're giving you back." For a moment nothing happened. Then, the box shuddered violently, the rope snapping as the lid flew open. The doll rose, hovering in midair, its blue eyes blazing with unnatural light. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the clearing, sending shivers down their spines. "You cannot leave me," a voice whispered, though its source was unclear. Emma stepped forward, her fear giving way to a strange sense of defiance. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady. Clara's head snapped toward Emma, her porcelain face cracking slightly. "And neither do you." The air around the tree grew heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Clara hovered above the box, her cracked porcelain face casting faint, eerie reflections in the moonlight. Emma couldn't look away. "Emma, stay back," Claire shouted, reaching for her daughter. But Emma stood frozen, transfixed by the doll's piercing blue eyes. A chilling wind surged through the clearing, rattling the branches of the gnarled tree, and the fog thickened until it seemed to wrap around them like a living thing. Clara's voice echoed again, soft but menacing. "You think you can give me back? After everything I've shown you?" Emma blinked as a sudden, vivid image flooded her mind. She was no longer standing in the clearing but inside an unfamiliar house. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle, its flame casting distorted shadows on the walls. In the corner sat Abigail, Margaret's sister. She was much younger than Margaret's stories had described, her face gaunt and her eyes empty. She held Clara tightly, rocking back and forth as if trying to comfort herself. "Don't leave me," Abigail whispered, but the words weren't directed at Emma. She was speaking to the doll. The vision shifted. Now Emma saw a group of pale, translucent figures encircling the tree, the same tree that now loomed in the clearing. Their faces were blurred, but their presence was suffocating, their silent stares heavy with accusation. The vision snapped away as abruptly as it had come, and Emma staggered back, gasping for breath. "Emma!" Claire's voice broke through the fog. "I'm fine," Emma stammered, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Margaret's voice was urgent. "We need to end this now." Before she could finish, Clara let out a piercing shriek, the sound twisting into a cacophony of overlapping voices. The figures Emma had seen in her vision began to appear, their forms flickering like dying flames around the clearing. The wind howled, and the ropes binding the box unraveled as if cut by unseen hands. Clara floated higher, her presence growing more menacing with each passing second. "Do you see now?" Clara's voice was cold, layered with the tones of many others. I am not a thing to be discarded. Emma's heart raced. She could feel an unrelenting pull, as if the doll were tethering her to the spot. Her mind raced, trying to understand why Clara seemed so focused on her. Margaret stepped forward, holding a small book she had carried from the house. Its worn leather cover was embossed with a faded symbol, and she flipped through its pages frantically. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. "What is that?" Claire asked, pulling Emma closer to her side. Margaret didn't look up. "It's something my father found after Abigail disappeared. A way to send Clara back. If it works." Margaret began to read from the book, her trembling voice barely audible over the howling wind. The language was unfamiliar, guttural and harsh, but the moment she spoke the first words, the air around them seemed to vibrate. Clara screamed, her body convulsing as cracks spread across her porcelain surface like spiderwebs. The glowing figures around the tree shifted closer, their forms growing sharper. Emma felt a pang of something. Pity? Sadness? She wasn't sure. But the figures didn't seem threatening now. They seemed trapped. "Margaret, what's happening to them?" she asked, her voice quivering. Margaret didn't pause in her recitation, but her expression darkened. "They're the ones Clara's taken before. She binds them to herself, just like she tried to bind Abby." Clara's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "You can't save them. You can't save anyone." The doll's laughter was cut short as the gnarled tree behind her began to creak and groan. Its roots shifted, tearing through the earth like claws, and the hollow at its base widened into a yawning abyss. Margaret's voice faltered as Clara turned her glowing eyes toward her. "You think words can stop me? I'll never go back." The book trembled in Margaret's hands, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The energy in the air grew heavier, and Emma could feel it pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Grandma!" "Stop!" Emma shouted, but Margaret shook her head. "No, Emma. This is the only way." But Emma wasn't so sure. The glowing figures were moving closer to Clara, their hands outstretched as if reaching for her. Their eyes, though empty, seemed to plead with Emma. Clara screamed again, and the figures recoiled as if struck. Emma felt a sudden surge of anger. Not her own, but something primal and overwhelming. It came from Clara, and it was directed at the glowing figures. "They're not her victims," Emma realized aloud. "They're trying to stop her." "What are you talking about?" Claire asked, panic rising in her voice. Emma stepped forward, her fear replaced by a strange calm. She reached out toward Clara, her hand brushing the doll's cracked surface. The cold was unbearable, but Emma didn't pull back. "Emma, no!" Margaret screamed. Clara's eyes locked onto Emma's. "You think you can take my power? You're nothing." But Emma didn't let go. Instead, she focused on the glowing figures, willing them to come closer. "Help me," she whispered. The glowing figures surged forward, their hands reaching for Clara. The doll writhed, her porcelain face shattering further with each passing second. "No, I won't go back," Clara shrieked, her voice breaking into 1,000 discordant notes. The tree's hollow began to pull at the air around it, a vortex forming that tugged at Clara and the glowing figures. The energy surged, and Emma felt herself being pulled toward the tree as well. Margaret lunged forward, grabbing Emma and holding her back with all her strength. "Don't let go," she cried. Clara let out one final, ear-splitting scream as the glowing figures enveloped her, dragging her into the hollow. The vortex collapsed with a deafening roar, and the forest fell silent. The doll was gone. Emma, Claire, and Margaret stood in the clearing. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The gnarled tree was still, its branches no longer menacing. "It's over," Margaret said, though her voice was tinged with doubt. But Emma wasn't so sure. She could still feel a faint coldness lingering in her fingertips, and the memory of Clara's eyes burned in her mind. As they made their way back to the house, the silence of the forest seemed heavier than before, as if the trees were watching. And in the shadows, something stirred. The house stood in an unsettling stillness when they returned. Margaret bolted the door behind them, her hands trembling. Claire set a flashlight on the table, its beam cutting through the darkened living room. The storm had knocked out the power, leaving shadows to stretch long and ominous across the walls. Emma sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't spoken since the vortex in the woods swallowed Clara and the glowing figures. Emma? Claire knelt beside her, brushing strands of damp hair from her daughter's face. Are you okay? Emma nodded, but her eyes were distant. She's still there, she murmured. Margaret turned sharply. What do you mean? She's not gone, Emma whispered. I can feel her. Watching. Claire hugged her daughter tightly. You're safe now. Clara's gone. Grandma made sure of it, but Emma wasn't convinced. The cold touch of the doll lingered on her fingertips, and the whispers in the woods replayed endlessly in her mind. Margaret lit an old oil lamp, its flickering flame casting a dim warmth around the room. She retrieved the leather-bound book from her bag and placed it on the dining table. The pages were warped, water-stained from their earlier ordeal, but the eerie symbols within remained clear. Mom, what is that thing? Claire asked, gesturing to the book. Margaret sighed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. It's a journal? Or a spellbook, depending on how you look at it. My father found it after Abigail disappeared. He believed it was the key to understanding what happened to her. Did it work? Claire asked. Margaret hesitated. No. By the time he tried to use it, Clara's hold on Abigail was too strong. He lost her. Emma, listening quietly, finally spoke. But we didn't lose me. Why? Margaret didn't have an answer. She stared at the book as if it might explain, but its silent pages offered no comfort. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion took hold of them. Claire convinced Emma to lie down in the guest bedroom upstairs, promising to stay close. I'll be right next door, Claire said, smoothing Emma's hair. Emma nodded but clutched her blanket tightly. As Claire turned off the bedside lamp, the darkness felt heavier than before. The house creaked with every gust of wind, but it wasn't the storm that kept Emma awake. It was the faint sound of whispering. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the longer she lay still, the clearer it became. The voice wasn't loud. It was soft, insistent, calling her name. Emma, Emma. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to hear. The whisper wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the hallway. Unable to ignore it, Emma slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She opened the bedroom door slowly, peeking into the dimly lit hallway. The whispering grew louder, drawing her toward the staircase. She tiptoed closer, her breath hitching when she saw a faint light glowing at the bottom of the stairs. Emma. The voice was familiar now. It wasn't Clara. It was Abigail. Compelled by curiosity and a strange sense of familiarity, Emma descended the stairs. The glowing light led her to the living room, where the oil lamp flickered weakly. On the table, the book lay open, its pages flipping on their own. Emma, stop! Margaret's voice startled Emma, and she whirled around to see her grandmother rushing into the room. What are you doing here? Margaret demanded, her face pale. I heard her, Emma stammered. Who? Abigail, Emma whispered. She's still here. Margaret's expression darkened. No, Abigail's gone. Clara took her. Whatever you heard, it wasn't her. But Emma wasn't convinced. She sounded scared, like she needed help. Margaret grabbed the book and slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the silent house. This book has caused enough harm already. You're not to touch it again, do you understand? Emma nodded reluctantly, but the seed of doubt had been planted. If Abigail was calling for help, how could they ignore her? The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though no one slept well. By morning, the storm had subsided, but the oppressive atmosphere in the house remained. Emma sat by the window, watching the forest sway gently in the wind. The tree from the night before stood out among the others, its gnarled branches etched into her memory. As she stared, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of white among the dark trunks. It was gone before she could focus, but her stomach tightened with unease. "Emma, breakfast," Claire called from the kitchen. She joined her mother and grandmother at the table, but her appetite was non-existent. Margaret broke the silence. "I think it's best if we leave today." Claire looked surprised. "You want to leave the house?" "It's not safe here anymore," Margaret admitted. "Not for Emma. But what about Abigail?" Emma blurted out. Margaret froze. "What about her?" "She's still out there," Emma insisted. "We can't just leave her." Claire frowned. "Emma, we don't know that. It's probably just your mind playing tricks after everything that's happened." But Margaret didn't look so certain. Her hand trembled as she reached for her tea, and Emma caught the flicker of guilt in her eyes. Later that afternoon, while her mother and grandmother packed, Emma slipped outside. The forest was quieter than before, but its stillness felt unnatural. She followed the path they had taken the night before, her feet carrying her toward the tree as if guided by an unseen force. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less strange. The hollow at the base of the tree had sealed, leaving no sign of the vortex that had swallowed Clara. "Emma," the whisper returned, faint but unmistakable. She turned toward the sound, her pulse quickening. "Abigail?" A chill ran down her spine as the air around her grew colder. The whisper came again, this time from deeper within the forest. Emma hesitated, glancing back toward the house. She knew she should go back, but the pull was too strong. She took a cautious step forward, then another. The trees seemed to close in around her, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. "Help me," the voice pleaded. Emma broke into a run, her fear outweighed by a desperate need to find Abigail. The forest grew darker as she went, the trees blocking out the fading sunlight. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, she stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows boarded and its roof sagging. "Emma," the whisper came from inside. Emma approached the cabin cautiously, the floorboards of the porch creaking under her weight. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. "Come in," the voice urged. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open. The interior was dim and cluttered, the air thick with dust and decay. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls, similar to those in Margaret's book. In the corner of the room, a figure sat slumped against the wall. It was Abigail, or what was left of her. Her hollow eyes stared at Emma, and her lips moved faintly, though no sound came out. In her lap sat Clara, the doll's cracked face twisted into a sinister grin. "Emma," Abigail rasped. Before Emma could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The air inside the cabin was suffocating, heavy with the scent of decay and something far worse, a wrongness that seeped into Emma's very bones. Abigail's gaunt figure, motionless in the corner, was a shadow of the bright girl she'd seen in the photographs. Her pale, brittle fingers clutched the doll in a grip that seemed born of both terror and unwilling devotion. Emma took a trembling step forward, her voice catching in her throat. "Abigail?" The girl's hollow eyes turned toward her, the movement jerky and unnatural, as if her body resisted the act. Abigail's lips parted, but her voice was faint, barely audible over the oppressive silence. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her words carrying a weight that sent a chill down Emma's spine. Before Emma could respond, Clara's porcelain face twisted, the cracks along her cheeks deepening. Her eyes, once dull, now glowed faintly, exuding malice. "Ah, another guest," Clara's voice oozed mockery, though her lips never moved. "How kind of you to join us, Emma." Emma staggered back, her heart racing. "What are you? What have you done to her?" Clara chuckled, the sound low and cruel. "I am what I have always been, an instrument of justice, a keeper of balance. But poor Abigail here. She wasn't strong enough to endure." Abigail's head jerked unnaturally, her sunken eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It hurts," she rasped. "Make it stop. Let her go." Emma shouted, her fear momentarily replaced by anger. Clara's grin widened. "Oh, but why would I do that? Abigail and I have an agreement. She belongs to me, just as you will in time. Back at the house, Margaret slammed the trunk of her car shut, glancing toward the forest with mounting unease. Where's Emma? Claire froze, her eyes darting toward the house. I thought she was inside. Margaret's face paled. No, she's gone. Realization struck them both like a bolt of lightning. She went back to the woods. Claire whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Margaret grabbed the old leather book from the passenger seat. We have to find her. Now. Claire hesitated. That book? What are you planning to do? Margaret's expression hardened. What I should have done years ago. It's the only way to stop Clara. In the cabin, Emma's fear gave way to determination. She edged closer to Abigail, who flinched as if expecting punishment. I'm going to help you, Emma promised, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her. Clara's laughter filled the room. Help? Oh, darling, you can't even help yourself. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and twisting as shadows danced like living things. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister energy. Emma glanced at them, recognition sparking. These are the same as in Grandma's book. Clara's grin faltered, if only for a moment. Ah, Margaret, always meddling where she doesn't belong. Emma seized the moment of distraction. What do you want? Why are you doing this? Clara tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing. You humans are so blind to the consequences of your actions. I am a vessel for those who were wronged, a voice for the silenced. Abigail's family betrayed her, just as yours betrayed me. My family? Emma asked, confusion mingling with fear. Clara's laughter returned, louder, more unhinged. Oh, sweet child, your bloodline is steeped in treachery. Margaret knows the truth. Ask her about the debt she's tried so hard to bury. Margaret and Claire raced through the woods, the storm's aftermath leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. The path to the cursed tree loomed ahead, its skeletal branches stark against the dimming sky. Emma! Claire shouted, her voice echoing through the forest. Margaret clutched the book tightly, her fingers trembling. She could feel the pull of the dark magic emanating from the clearing. We're close, she said, her voice grim. As they neared the tree, the faint glow of the cabin came into view. Margaret froze. No, she's in there. Claire turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. What's in there? Margaret's voice broke. Everything I tried to protect her from. Inside the cabin, Clara's hold on the room intensified. The shadows grew thicker, pressing in on Emma as she stood her ground. You're wrong, Emma said, her voice steady. Whatever happened in the past, I won't let you hurt anyone else. Clara's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. Brave words for a frightened little girl. Emma glanced at Abigail, whose hollow eyes pleaded silently. You don't have to stay with her, Emma said softly. You can fight. Abigail shook her head weakly. She's too strong. No, Emma insisted. She feeds on fear. We have to stand together. The cabin door burst open, and Margaret stepped inside, the book clutched in her hands. Claire followed close behind, her face pale but determined. Let her go, Clara, Margaret commanded, her voice firm. Clara turned her glowing eyes on Margaret. Ah, the matriarch returns. Tell them, Margaret. Tell them the price of their freedom. Margaret hesitated, the weight of decades of secrets threatening to crush her. Emma, get back, she said instead, opening the book. Margaret began to chant, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light battling the oppressive shadows. Clara screamed, her porcelain face cracking further. You think you can banish me? I am eternal. The room erupted into chaos. The walls seemed to dissolve, revealing the swirling void beyond. Abigail cried out, her fragile body convulsing as Clara's hold on her wavered. Emma grabbed Abigail's hand, her grip firm. I won't let go. Margaret's chant reached a crescendo, the book glowing brightly. The doll shrieked, its twisted form beginning to disintegrate. No! Clara howled, her voice filled with fury and desperation. The light from the book engulfed the room, and for a moment, everything was silent. When the light faded, the cabin was gone. Emma, Margaret, Claire, and Abigail stood in the clearing, the cursed tree now nothing more than a rotted stump. Abigail slumped to the ground, her gaunt face showing the first hints of life. She looked at Emma with tears in her eyes. "Thank you." Margaret closed the book, her hands trembling. "It's over," she said, though her voice carried doubt. Claire hugged Emma tightly, relief washing over her. But Emma's gaze lingered on the stump, where a faint, familiar whisper echoed in the wind. "Emma!" The wind howled through the clearing, carrying with it faint whispers that made Emma's skin crawl. Though the cursed cabin had vanished, the air around the tree stump still felt heavy, like a storm waiting to unleash itself. Abigail clung to Emma's arm, her body trembling as if the sinister energy of Clara still lingered nearby. Margaret stood stiffly, clutching the ancient book to her chest, her face pale and drawn. "We need to leave," she said, her voice sharp. "This place isn't safe." Claire, her arms crossed tightly, nodded toward Abigail. "What about her? Is she going to be okay?" "I'll be fine," Abigail murmured, though her voice was shaky. Her hollow eyes searched Emma's face for reassurance. Emma forced a smile. "We'll get you somewhere safe. Don't worry." As they started back toward the house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the shadows. The return to the house was a tense journey. No one spoke as they trudged through the forest, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound. Emma stayed close to Abigail, who stumbled with every few steps, her frail frame clearly drained from the ordeal. Margaret brought up the rear, clutching the old book as though it were a lifeline. Her gaze flicked around the trees, wary of the unseen. When they reached the house, Claire bolted the door and drew the curtains, shutting out the oppressive darkness. "Tea," Claire muttered, disappearing into the kitchen. "We all need tea." Emma helped Abigail onto the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The girl stared blankly at the floor, her lips moving soundlessly. Margaret sat at the dining table, placing the book carefully in front of her. She rested her head in her hands, as though the weight of what had happened was finally catching up to her. "What did Clara mean?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. She stood across from Margaret, her arms crossed. "She said our family betrayed her." Margaret didn't look up. "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated," Emma snapped. "If this is about me, about our family, I deserve to know the truth." Claire entered with a tray of steaming mugs, her hands shaking as she set them down. "She's right, Margaret. We've been in the dark for too long." Margaret sighed heavily, finally meeting Emma's gaze. Clara wasn't just a doll. She was once a girl, an ordinary girl who lived in this very house over a century ago. Emma felt a chill creep up her spine. "What happened to her?" Margaret hesitated. "She was wronged by someone in our family, betrayed." Her anger and grief became something unnatural. She cursed this house, this land, and tied her spirit to the doll. "Generations of our family have suffered because of it." Emma's stomach twisted. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "I thought I could protect you. I thought if I kept the book hidden, if I stayed vigilant, Clara would never resurface." "But she did," Claire interjected. "And now she's stronger than ever." Abigail stirred on the couch, her voice barely a whisper. "She's not gone." Everyone turned to her. "What do you mean?" Emma asked gently. Abigail's hollow eyes locked onto Emma's. "Clara's still here. She's angry," her voice cracked, "and she's coming back for you." Margaret's face turned ashen. "That's not possible." "The ritual didn't work," Abigail interrupted. "She's not tied to the cabin or the doll. She's tied to your family. And now she's tied to Emma." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "What does that mean?" Abigail shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "She marked you. I saw it when you touched the doll. She's waiting for the right moment to take you." Claire swore under her breath. "What do we do now?" Margaret flipped open the book, her hands trembling. "There has to be something in here. A way to sever the connection before it's too late." As the hours stretched into the night, Margaret pored over the book, muttering incantations and deciphering ancient texts. Emma paced the room, her nerves frayed. "I can't just sit here," Emma finally said. "If Clara's after me, I need to face her. End this." "No." Margaret's voice was sharp. "You don't understand how dangerous she is. Facing her without a plan is suicide." "Do we even have a plan?" Claire asked, her tone edged with frustration. Margaret hesitated. "Not yet, but there's a ritual mentioned here. It might work, but it requires a blood tie to the one Clara first cursed." Emma froze. "A blood tie? You mean me?" Margaret nodded reluctantly. "It's the only way. The ritual requires the marked one to confront Clara directly, in the place where her spirit was first bound. The attic," Claire whispered. Emma's blood ran cold. Margaret explained the steps of the ritual, her voice shaking as she detailed the risks. The book's instructions were cryptic, warning of the consequences of failure. "Once we start, there's no turning back," Margaret said. "You have to be prepared for anything." Emma swallowed hard. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Emma. Clara feeds on fear, but she can't win if you stay strong." Abigail spoke up, her voice trembling. "She'll try to trick you. Don't listen to her lies." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's do this." The group climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, their footsteps echoing ominously. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint sound of whispers began to fill the silence. When they reached the attic, Emma felt a wave of nausea. The room was suffused with an unnatural darkness, the faint outline of the cursed doll's stand still visible in the corner. Margaret set the book down on the floor, drawing a protective circle with salt and placing candles at each point. "Emma, stand in the center. Claire and I will hold the circle. Whatever happens, don't leave it." Emma stepped into the circle, her heart pounding. "What do I do?" Margaret began chanting, her voice rising and falling in rhythm. The candles flickered, their flames bending toward Emma as though drawn by an invisible force. The whispers grew louder, transforming into a chorus of mocking laughter. Then Clara appeared. Her form was no longer bound to the doll. She stood before Emma as a shadowy figure, her cracked porcelain face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Foolish girl," Clara hissed. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Emma's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not afraid of you." Clara's laughter echoed through the attic. "You should be." Clara's form shifted, becoming more human-like. She extended a hand toward Emma. "Join me and I'll spare the others. Refuse, and they'll all suffer for your defiance." Emma glanced at Margaret and Claire, their faces pale with fear. She thought of Abigail, who had endured so much. "No," Emma said firmly. "You don't control me." Clara's eyes flared with rage, and the attic erupted into chaos. The walls shook, and the air filled with unearthly screams. Margaret's chant grew louder, her voice unwavering despite the chaos. The protective circle glowed brightly, forcing Clara back. "You can't win," Clara screeched, her form beginning to dissolve. Emma stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're wrong. You're done hurting people." Clara let out one final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the void. The attic fell silent. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had happened settling over them. "Is it over?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded slowly. "For now." Emma stared at the spot where Clara had stood, her heart heavy. She knew this wasn't the end. The attic was silent now, but the air still carried a palpable weight. Emma stood in the middle of the protective circle, her fists clenched and her breath heavy. Clara's final scream echoed in her ears, though the entity had dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over. "Emma," Margaret said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it." Emma didn't respond. Something about the silence felt wrong, like the eerie calm before a storm. She stepped out of the circle, her legs shaky, and looked around the attic. The shadows seemed to dance on the edges of her vision, refusing to settle. Claire, pale but composed, let out a long breath. If Clara's gone, why does this place still feel wrong? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the book, flipping through its ancient pages with trembling hands. Her silence only deepened the unease. Back downstairs, the group gathered in the living room. Abigail sat curled up on the couch, her gaze fixed on nothing. Emma watched her sister carefully, noting how pale she looked, as if Clara's presence had drained the very life from her. Claire paced the room. "We need to burn that book," she said abruptly, pointing at the tattered volume in Margaret's hands. "No," Margaret replied sharply. "This book is the only thing keeping us alive right now. If Clara left any part of herself behind, we'll need its knowledge." "Left any part of herself?" Emma repeated, her voice rising. "What does that mean, Margaret? I thought we defeated her." Margaret closed the book with a sigh, rubbing her temples. "Clara's energy is deeply tied to this house, to your family. While her form may be gone, her essence could still linger." "That's not comforting," Claire muttered. Emma felt a pang of frustration. "So what do we do? Just wait for her to come back?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "We have to finish this. Permanently." Margaret spread the book out on the dining table, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and text in a language no one else understood. "There's another ritual," she explained. "One that can sever Clara's ties to this place for good. But it's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Emma asked, leaning forward. Margaret hesitated. "It requires a sacrifice." The room fell silent. "What kind of sacrifice?" Claire finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's expression darkened. "A life." Emma's stomach churned. "You mean someone has to die?" Margaret nodded grimly. Clara's curse was born from her own violent death. To unbind her completely, the ritual demands a life to balance the scales. Abigail's voice trembled as she spoke. "That's not fair. We didn't do anything to her." "No," Margaret agreed. "But we're the ones bound by her curse. This is the price of freedom." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "There has to be another way." Margaret watched her, sympathy and resignation in her eyes. "I'll keep looking, but the book is clear. If we don't act soon, Clara will regain her strength, and next time we may not survive." Claire slammed her fist on the table. "This is insane. We're not just going to offer someone up, are we?" "No," Emma said firmly. "We're not." Margaret gave her a weary look. "You may not have a choice." The tension in the room was suffocating. Abigail began to cry softly, and Claire moved to comfort her. Emma, unable to sit still, paced the room, her mind racing for alternatives. Then, an idea struck her. What if the sacrifice doesn't have to be human? Margaret looked up, frowning. "What are you suggesting?" Emma gestured toward the book. "Clara's essence is tied to the doll, right? What if we use that connection against her? Destroy the doll completely, along with her essence?" Margaret considered this, her brow furrowed. "It's risky. If the doll's destruction doesn't sever the connection, we could make her even more powerful." "But it's worth trying," Claire said, her voice determined. "We're not killing anyone, Margaret. That's not an option." The next challenge was finding the doll. Since Clara's disappearance, the porcelain figure had vanished. "She's hiding it," Abigail whispered. The group turned to her, startled. Abigail looked up from the couch, her eyes filled with an eerie certainty. "Clara doesn't want us to destroy it. She's keeping it close, but I can feel it. It's still in the house." Emma knelt beside her sister. "Abigail, are you sure?" Abigail nodded. "I see it when I close my eyes. It's in the basement." Claire shuddered. "Of course it's in the basement. Where else would it be?" Margaret grabbed a flashlight and handed it to Emma. "Let's go. The longer we wait, the stronger Clara gets." The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and heavy. The single bulb that lit the stairs flickered as they descended, casting long, shifting shadows. Emma led the way, gripping the flashlight tightly. Claire followed close behind, clutching a crowbar she'd grabbed from the garage. Margaret brought up the rear, the book tucked under her arm. Where do we even start? Claire asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. Emma swept the flashlight beam across the cluttered basement. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten belongings filled every corner, creating a labyrinth of shadowy shapes. Abigail's words echoed in Emma's mind. I can feel it. Over there, Emma said, pointing toward a dark corner where an old wardrobe stood, its doors slightly ajar. Margaret hesitated. Be careful. Emma approached the wardrobe, her heart pounding. She reached for the handle, pausing briefly to steady her breathing. Then, with a quick motion, she yanked the door open. Inside, the doll sat on a dusty shelf, its cracked porcelain face staring back at her. The moment Emma touched the doll, the temperature in the basement plummeted. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A low, guttural laugh filled the air, reverberating through the walls. She's here, Margaret whispered. Suddenly, the shadows came alive. Clara's figure materialized, her form more menacing than ever. Her glowing red eyes locked onto Emma, and the room shook violently. You think you can destroy me? Clara's voice was a distorted snarl. This doll is nothing compared to the power I hold now. Emma gripped the doll tightly. You don't scare me. Clara's laughter grew louder, more mocking. You should be scared. You've sealed your fate. Margaret began chanting from the book, her voice rising above the chaos. The shadows recoiled, and Clara screamed in rage. Emma held the doll aloft. If you're tied to this, then you're going with it. With all her strength, she hurled the doll to the ground. It shattered into countless pieces, each fragment glowing with an unearthly light before disintegrating into ash. Clara's scream pierced the air, a sound so terrible it made Emma's ears ring. Her form flickered and dissolved, the shadows retreating into nothingness. The basement fell silent. The group stood in stunned silence, the realization slowly sinking in. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house was gone. Did it work? Claire asked cautiously. Margaret nodded, though she looked unsure. I think so. Emma stared at the pile of ash where the doll had been. I hope so, but in her heart, she knew the battle wasn't over. The house was quieter than it had been in weeks. The oppressive energy that once clung to every corner seemed to dissipate after the doll was destroyed. The basement was still, the air lightening as if a heavy storm had passed. Emma, Claire, Margaret, and Abigail stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the pile of ash where the doll had been. It's over, Claire said, breaking the silence. Margaret hesitated. It might be. Emma turned sharply. What do you mean, might be? We destroyed the doll. Clara's gone. Margaret looked at the ash, her face tight with worry. Clara's essence was tied to the doll, yes, but curses like hers can leave echoes. Residual energy. We need to be sure. Emma clenched her fists. After everything we've been through, I'm not letting her haunt us any longer. Back upstairs, the group began cleaning the remnants of the night's chaos. Broken furniture, toppled bookshelves, and scorch marks from Clara's rage made the living room look like a war zone. Abigail sat on the couch, her face pale but her eyes regaining some of their sparkle. Do you really think she's gone? Abigail asked quietly. Emma sat next to her, pulling her into a hug. She's gone. I won't let her hurt you again. Margaret wasn't so sure. She stood near the fireplace, staring into the flames as though seeking answers. The book lay open in her hands, and she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed. Margaret, Claire called. You're making everyone nervous. If there's something we need to know, just say it. Margaret sighed. The ritual was supposed to sever Clara's connection to this house, but there's a chance some of her energy remains tied to you. She glanced at Abigail, then Emma. Or tied to your family. Emma stood. If that's the case, how do we get rid of it? Margaret hesitated. There's one last ritual. A cleansing. But it requires everyone's participation and complete honesty. Honesty about what? Claire asked. About your fears, Margaret replied. Your guilt. Clara's power fed on secrets, on things people were too afraid to confront. To cleanse the house, you'll need to confront those things openly. They gathered in the living room as the storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the walls and thunder rattling the windows. Margaret drew another protective circle on the floor with salt, placing candles at its points. This will force any lingering energy to surface, Margaret explained. But it will also expose us, to each other and to whatever might still be here. Emma lit the candles, her hands trembling. Let's just get it over with. Margaret began the chant, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The air grew colder, and the flames of the candles flickered unnaturally. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp. Shadows stretched across the walls, and whispers filled the air. "It's her," Abigail whispered, clutching Emma's arm. "No," Margaret said firmly. "It's the remnants of her curse. Don't let it scare you." The whispers grew louder, forming words. "You think you can escape me?" Emma's heart pounded. She stepped into the center of the circle, her voice trembling but defiant. "You're nothing but a memory. You have no power here." The shadows recoiled, but the voice laughed. "Is that what you think? You've always been afraid, Emma. Afraid of failing, of losing. That fear made you weak, and it still does." Emma froze. The words struck a nerve, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. "Emma," Margaret urged, "speak the truth. The curse can't hold power over you if you face it." Emma closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared. I've always been scared. I couldn't protect my sister. I couldn't protect anyone." The shadows faltered, the whispers growing softer. Abigail stepped forward. "You did protect me, Emma. You're the reason I'm still here." The voice snarled, "She's lying. She doesn't believe in you." Abigail shouted back, her small frame trembling with anger. "You're wrong. Emma is the only one who believed in me when no one else did." The shadows hissed and writhed, shrinking further. Margaret turned to Claire. "It's your turn." Claire shook her head. "I don't have anything to confess." "Everyone has something," Margaret pressed. Claire crossed her arms. "Fine. I'm angry. I'm angry that we're stuck in this house. Angry that I ever came here, and angry that I couldn't do more to help." The voice cackled. "And there it is. You'll never forgive yourself, Claire. You're just as powerless as the rest of them." Claire's face hardened. "Maybe I can't change the past, but I'm not letting you control my future." The room shook violently, and the shadows retreated further. As each person confronted their fears and guilt, the whispers grew weaker, the shadows diminishing. Finally, Margaret stepped into the circle, holding the book aloft. "Clara, your power is broken. You have no hold here. We banish you forever." She threw the book into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the ancient tome in seconds. A piercing scream filled the room, but it was different this time. Fading, powerless. The shadows dissolved completely, leaving the house bathed in an eerie stillness. The storm passed by morning, sunlight streaming through the windows. The house felt different, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. "Is it really over?" Abigail asked. Margaret nodded, though her exhaustion was evident. "It's over." Emma hugged her sister tightly. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. Claire stretched, her face showing a rare smile. "So, anyone else want to move far away from creepy old houses?" Emma laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. "Absolutely." As they packed their belongings and prepared to leave, Emma took one last look at the house. It no longer felt like a prison or a battleground. It was just a house, its dark history finally laid to rest. For the first time, she felt free.